Hello, everybody. Can I see from you who here wants to change something about Prague? Few hands, almost. All right, good. Because I'm an urban designer, and if you like the status quo, you do not need urban design. In my job, I'm Chief Urban Designer at the City of New York Department of City Planning. And I work with many young people to produce the rules, plans, and products that change the city. I want to talk a little bit about what urban design is, because some people think that urban design builds cities. It does not. Urban design builds the tools that build cities, and others do it. But urban design is, of course, at the center of everything. At the Department of City Planning, we're a few people, but we work in the middle of 300 planners and economists and demographers and others, and swirl around us, but we hold the pen. We work at the intersection of politics, finance, and design. I like to say you can be the best designer in the world, but if you can't design under the pressure of politics and the pressure of money, then you're not really an urban designer. Even though we work at the scale of cities, the smallest dimensions matter. Earlier today, we heard talk about curb heights. Well, we literally measure that and make sure that they fit into the large scheme of things so that every scale works, from the smallest to the largest. Finally, if a place is worth remembering, we feel that it's worth drawing. And we spend much of our time out in the city simply drawing what we see as a way of getting the principles of public space inside us and being able to translate and discuss with our colleagues. One thing that we've learned, and I'm seeing is beginning to be learned here, is something that seems paradoxical, but that is that listening is what changes the city. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. I want to begin with a very short urban design history of New York. New York, 400 years ago, before the Dutch arrived, was an incredible city, but a city of ecosystems. More than 50 different neighborhoods, each ecologically different, that we've recently been able to reconstruct through the work of Eric Sanderson, a biologist working with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And we were able to see how New York functioned as a sustainable ecology before a large-scale population growth. That growth, of course, began to really rise rapidly during the Industrial Revolution. And in anticipation of that growth, we had something called the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, which put a grid across all of Manhattan. This would have made it the biggest city in the world at the time. You'll notice that there is no space in the center. There were no parks laid out at the time because the commissioners believed that our rivers, which really are huge, the East River and the Hudson, that they would provide a place for recreation for New Yorkers. And as New York developed, the grid of Manhattan started to fill in with railroads and factories and houses, and it became so dense that by the middle of the 19th century, there was no place to go for nature. The shoreline, which the commissioners thought would be available for recreation, they hadn't thought about the steam engine being applied to ships. With the steam engine applied to ships, ships could dock anywhere on Manhattan, and the whole shoreline became filled with piers and became private property. So that option was taken away, and you really had no place to go for some peace and quiet with your family if you were a worker in the 1850s. And you wanted peace and quiet, your best chance was to go to a graveyard. That brings me to my first great urban designer of New York, Frederick Law Olmsted. He's the one who proposed Central Park. He's the one who designed Central Park and saw it through politically to completion. It was an amazing gamble for the city at the time. An enormous chunk was taken off the tax rolls and made into a park so big that no one had ever tried this before. No one could even cost estimate it because it had never been done at this scale. But it succeeded. And it made New York very much the capital of the 20th century. The 20th century began in urban design terms in New York with a crime. And that crime happened on Wall Street. The Equitable Insurance Company had a parcel of land on Pine Street and Wall. And it built its building 42 stories straight up, no setbacks. And that building stole light and air from its neighbors. So in something very unusual for Wall Street, the other titans and financiers of Wall Street asked the government for regulation so that their land could be protected in the future. And that decision to regulate how buildings are built as they go tall turned into the 1916 zoning plan for New York, which was a wonderfully simple set of rules that said, depending on the width of your street, your building can go up at the property line to that height, and then it begins to angle back at a certain ratio until you get to 25% of your lot, and then the sky is the limit. You're welcome to go as high as you want. And it led to some incredible building forms like the Chrysler Building. Even that zoning, though, wasn't big enough to contain the growing city in the 20th century. And there we get my second great urban designer of New York, and that's Robert Moses. Moses was an authoritarian, top-down leader. He was actually Parks Commissioner once in his career, just like Adrian Benepe. What Moses did, though, was in his career that lasted almost 60 years, he never gave up a title. So he accumulated power over time. And he was a proponent of the automobile in the city. But he also built at a huge scale and was able to accomplish a sort of growth that allowed New York to stay ahead of the curve in the 20th century. And at the peak of his power, he proposed a highway through Lower Manhattan. And at that point, he met my third great urban designer from New York, who was Jane Jacobs. Jane Jacobs was a mother in Greenwich Village, the neighborhood that he wanted to put his highway through. She organized grassroots, bottom-up opposition to Moses, who was the most powerful man, perhaps in the state of New York at that point. She fought Moses, and she won. But their battle continued. In 1961, two parallel publications came out. That same year, Jane Jacobs published The Death and Life of Great American Cities with a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, which became something of a Bible or a manual for the fine quality and fine grain of neighborhoods and streets and how to organize to be part of a movement that protects neighborhoods. The same year, the 1961 zoning resolution came out. That was an amendment based on Moses' principles of towers in the park that changed the 1916 zoning and made the city far easier to work in if you wanted to build towers in the park, parking, and other items that Moses had been able to put through sheer power. Those parallel documents set the stage for a generation. Call it dialogue, call it fighting. But there was two parallel tracks now in planning in New York ever since Moses and Jacobs clashed. And it was the top-down from the agencies and the bottom-up from the neighborhoods. In the intervening years, several events happened. We established community boards for each neighborhood so that the neighborhoods would have an organized voice in decisions about what the city was going to build. We also got rid of the Board of Estimate, which was a body in New York City government that could make decisions behind closed doors. And instead, there was a city council. Over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, these movements were finally solidified, codified into a set of laws called the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, ULURP. And that's what this incredibly complex diagram represents. This is a simpler diagram of what it represents. It means that every project in New York that is important must go through a process of a finite period of time, about 7 months, where it gets input from the top as well as from the bottom. The community boards get to vote on a proposal. The borough president gets to vote. Ultimately, the city council decides, and then the mayor can sign it into law. But nothing that emerges from this process is the same as it goes in. And what this has meant to New York and how it makes decisions is extremely important. Because like today, earlier today when we had that panel, people could stand up and state their views. They can be heard. The projects can change because of their views. So once we make a decision, then that decision can be carried out more effectively. And of course, nothing is as clear as that or as simple as that in New York. There are lawsuits. There are many ways of attempting to go beyond this sort of control. But if you look at a piece of zoning map in New York City and examine how it's changed over 1916 to 1961 to 2012, notice how the grain is getting finer and finer. The complexity of use is increasing. New York is growing, but at the same time becoming more like itself. New York does not have a master plan in the traditional European sense. We don't have a fixed image of what we want to become that we all work towards. We have a living document, which is called the zoning resolution and the zoning map. And we have a process for changing that is orderly and allows for bottom-up as well as top-down. That has given us a great flexibility to respond to challenges and opportunities as they arise. And the way we guide our response to those opportunities is through something called planNYC. Mayor Bloomberg launched planNYC on Earth Day in 2007. And it is a set of programs, but more importantly, it's a set of goals. Goals about how the city can grow to have 1 million more inhabitants and yet become sustainable in the future. Our urban design agenda as set out by planNYC is very simple. First of all, those 1 million more New Yorkers, how do we fit them within our fixed borders? Well, the answer is clear. If you look at where we're putting the new density, we're putting it where there are subway nodes. It's transit-oriented development. It's been, in New York, has been, I won't say invented it, but it's been part of New York's DNA for over 100 years. We build on the strength of our transit. We upzone and bring density where there are transit nodes, and areas where there are not, we sometimes even lower density, and therefore discourage density which would require automobiles and others which would then overwhelm roads. Our second major portion of our urban design agenda is sustainability. And it has two prongs. There's mitigation, which is to lower our carbon footprint. And we have a goal of reduction of 30% by 2030. And it's interesting, you'll see in this picture, these bubbles represent how much of our carbon footprint comes from what aspects of our city. And you'll see that most of our carbon in New York comes from our buildings. Partly that's because many of our buildings are older. Partly that's because relative to transportation, they take up a larger share of what is, for the United States, a very low carbon footprint. You'll notice our transportation from the subway, the tiny bubble of 1.4%. 7 million New Yorkers every day use the subway, and yet it contributes that little to our overall carbon footprint. The second side of sustainability, though, is not just about reducing future climate change. It's responding to climate change that has already occurred, and I'll talk about that a bit more later. But that's called adaptation, and that's a very important part of our urban design agenda. But finally, the third part of our urban design agenda is to improve the quality of civic life. And for us, improving civic life means improving public space. It doesn't matter how good we have been, how effective we have been in meeting our technical goals if at the same time we lose our ability to make the city a better place to be. So I can't say that enough as to how important it is, but there is no urban design without making civic space better. I'll give you an example of how New York gets things done. We've talked about this a little bit earlier, the Highline, but I'm going to go into quite a bit of technical detail. The project, I'm sure you all are familiar with it. It's a project that was actually started through some efforts of Robert Moses and others at the Port Authority back in the 1930s to elevate or train that used to run down the west side of Manhattan and consequently would bump into many people, to raise it up 16 feet into the air on a structure and bring it into the factories directly, and so leaving the ground planes better for pedestrians. Unfortunately, by the mid-1980s, those factories had left. The invention of the interstate highway system, jet airport transportation, other factors, greater global economic factors, moved manufacturing outside of New York, and a little bit of food processing stayed in that neighborhood. But even that, by 1984, the last train had run down the Highline. And the Highline just stood there. You know, it was massively built, a huge piece of infrastructure that in today's dollars would have easily cost $2 billion. The neighborhood was zoned for manufacturing. In New York, we regulate the types of uses that can go into certain lots, both by density, which means how big you can build on the lot, but also by the land use. It turns out that art galleries are allowed in manufacturing uses. So the area around the Highline became a haven for art galleries, which started to grow very significantly in the 1990s. People that owned land under the Highline saw this trend coming and saw the value of their land going up. And by zoning, by our existing rules, if there wasn't this structure on top of your land, you could otherwise build 5 stories. Pretty valuable. So a group of landowners formed an organization to lobby for the demolition of the Highline. Mayor Giuliani supported it. The project started going into the public pipeline. And then at a community board meeting to discuss the project, 2 regular citizens, not designers, not politicians, Joshua David and Rob Hammond, happened to sit next to each other. They met, and they knew they had to do something. They didn't know what this structure should be, but they felt it was wrong to tear it down. So they formed something called the Friends of the Highline, to explore it, to start raising money, to figure out an alternative to demolition. One of the Friends of the Highline was a woman named Amanda Burton. When Mayor Bloomberg won his job in the first term, he made her the head of city planning. So now the Friends of the Highline had someone in a position to actually help shape the neighborhood. They also had friends in the city council speaker and many other good connections. But at the last minute, this demolition order was rescinded, and the forces that are available within the agencies of government began to organize to figure out a better future for this piece of infrastructure and for the neighborhood around it. And that's what the Department of City Planning's major role was to use the tools of zoning that we had in a way that would accomplish certain goals, not just to make the Highline a park. We didn't quite yet know that that was even exactly what it would become, but to accomplish larger goals and to use the Highline itself as a way of improving the neighborhood around it. So yes, we wanted to transform the Highline into a unique linear park, but we also needed market rate housing in New York and affordable housing. We also did not want to, as we changed, lose the character of our art galleries in the district. We wanted to bring in other land uses to manufacturing, though, and have the neighborhood become more of a 24/7 place. We also, when the growth came, wanted to make sure that it did not physically occlude the Highline, that you could still see the Highline, that the sun could still hit the Highline. So the shape of the buildings and the placement to come became very important. And that resulted in something called the West Chelsea Special District, which was a series of amendments to the zoning resolution and the zoning map, which entered the Uniform Land Use Review process. Now the first step is to define the special district, then to zone for new residential uses at its perimeter, leave the manufacturing land use in the center so that you preserve the art galleries, and then, and this was the crucial part, because remember, there was some very well-financed opposition, people who wanted to demolish the Highline. use a tool of zoning that had been first developed when Grand Central Railroad Station had been saved a generation ago, which allows you to transfer the development rights from underneath the Highline to the perimeter. Here's the final mosaic of zoning, and here's the principle of how you transfer these air rights. You see the Highline there. We'd established a corridor 100 feet wide, and from that corridor, we allowed landowners to sell their air rights to buildings on the edge. And those air rights would go to the top of the buildings, which made them ever more valuable. So suddenly you got a situation where the private sector was quite happy. And instead of opposing the park, instead of wanting to demolish the Highline, they were now encouraging the legislation, the zoning to pass. We worked very hard in the department to sketch and figure out what the right relationship of the new park to the buildings around it should be. Eventually, those rules became something called a bulk envelope, where when development comes, the building limits were sculpted in a way to preserve the light and air and the views. And as an example, let me give you one case study here. And these are two buildings, one by Jean Nouvel, one by Neil Denari. Highline 23 is a new building adjacent to the Highline, and you see it there with the space where another building would have been had the Highline come down. And here's a Jean Nouvel building. So here's an overview of Chelsea, and you see the lot that was owned by the developers of HL23 there in the center. If the Highline had been torn down, 5 stories, perfectly good economic use, nothing wrong with that. But with the Highline preserved, you squeezed the air rights, the development potential of the land, into a shape as much as would allow in that location. You took the extra that remained, sold it over to the perimeter, and then the result was, as a neighborhood built out, it fit the form that we had hoped for it. So the result is you get the new building by Jean Nouvel, the new building by Neil Denari, and also the Highline Park itself. The economic amounts here are pretty substantial. In fact, I sometimes like to think, what would these people I consider the 3 great urban designers of New York think about this development? And from the point of view of Moses, I think he'd be pretty impressed at the scale of the numbers, because there we got about $100 million of initial public investment, which turned into $2 billion of private investment. And now that's gone up on both sides, and it continues to grow. More than 2,500 apartments, more than 12,000 jobs created. Moses would be impressed by the scale, but he would never believe that 2 people from the community could ever start something this big. I think Jane Jacobs would be pleased by the galleries and the fine-grained texture of the neighborhood, but she would be very suspicious of government and doubt that we could ever have written rules fine-grained enough to result in something like this. And finally, Olmsted, I'm sure, would have loved to walk down the Highline, but he would have thought we're crazy to put 20 foot in the air. So these are my 3 urban designers, and I think they're pleased by the Highline. But now I have another job for them, and it has to do with sustainability, but adaptation. How do we change New York to be able to withstand the forces of climate change that have already occurred? And what I'm showing you there is a nighttime image of Hurricane Sandy. And you can see the lights of the East Coast cities twinkling between the arms of the storm just before it was about to hit. Sandy was a superstorm. People thought it would be 100 years before it happened. But it did happen. I know, because I live in a neighborhood that was flooded. This is Sandy visiting my house as I opened the front door and the water started rushing in. And after this, I closed the door, I ran upstairs, you would hear the electricity begin to pop, the transformers went down, the city went black, and the next day the waters receded, but my neighborhood of Red Hook had been flooded and was changed forever. So now, not as a city official, but more as somebody who lives in a neighborhood, who loves their neighborhood, who wants to recover, who wants not just to build back as we were, but to build back in a way that we can survive the next hurricane, because the next hurricane is coming. I want to know what I can do, what urban design can do to change the neighborhood. That's urban design's greatest power, is to change cities, and we need it very badly now. I'll show you a little bit about the scale of the problem. This is an old map showing British military positions in 1792. And my neighborhood of Red Hook is this little portion right there. You can see the tip of Manhattan at the very top. You can see it was a very marshy place. Now here's a picture of Red Hook with the traditional topography, but then the modern street grid that's been overlaid on it. Obviously, there's an issue here. People filled in land that was very low-lying and built on it. And my house is there where the circle is. So what are we going to do? How are we going to make this resilient? Does it mean we should all abandon the neighborhood? Go away and let it go back to marshland? I don't think so. That's not what I want to do emotionally. It's not what I want to do economically. And I don't think it's what the city wants to do either. We don't abandon our neighborhoods. We have to find a way of designing them to protect them. Well, one solution is to say every house is on its own. Every person who owns a building has to fix it in a way to make it flood-proof. Build concrete walls, raise it up, doesn't matter. Individual, private person, you figure it out. The other way is for the government to step in, let's say, and build some kind of overarching protection. And do this in a way that the buildings can stay the same. You could do it at a neighborhood level, perhaps, by using some form of coastal protection system. Or you could do it in a regional level. And this is an underwater map of the New York region. You can probably just see how the Hudson River is coming down and Long Island is meeting. It's a very beautiful map. I like this one because all the political boundaries blur and you see just that everyone's in it together, all three states, Connecticut and New Jersey and New York. But each of these approaches, whether it's done at the individual house, whether it's done at the neighborhood, or whether it's done at the federal level, they require trade-offs and they require coordination. And there's no answer yet. But the question is one of risk. How do we share the risk? Maybe we'll come up with innovative ways of raising our floors when a flood comes. It's the sketch I made for my house as a way of trying to adapt. Maybe we'll come up with ways of making something on the coast that could protect us. This is a picture of Copenhagen's old fort that was turned into a beautiful promenade, and maybe there's a similar way that something that could hold back a storm surge could also become a lovely public park. We don't know yet, though, what the answer is going to be. This is my neighborhood. This is the view from my roof. You can see the Freedom Tower in the distance on the right. We're right across from Manhattan. But there are trade-offs. And government has to work in a coordinated way with a vision. It's only just begun. And as we go forward, as we start formulating what the specific questions are, I'm going to keep going back to my three great urban designers of New York, because if whatever solution we come up with doesn't satisfy them, it's not going to work. I think Moses is going to have to be impressed by the ability to work at the building scale, at the regional park scale, and at the infrastructure scale. Scales that he would consider something that he could do and no other. Jane Jacobs won't be satisfied if we somehow protect our houses from flood by raising the ground floor away from the pedestrian. let's say we just raised houses up and put parking under them, she would be horrified, because we would kill our streets if we did that. So to satisfy Jane Jacobs, we're going to have to come up with techniques or ways of sharing risk that we can keep our streets viable and keep the character of our neighborhood growing. And finally, I think Olmsted is going to be impressed by the way we harness the forces of nature to counter the forces of nature, that we come up with ways of making coastlines that have natural systems that are able to absorb the horizontal velocity of storm surges, that are able to withstand and grow in a way that we feel like we're managing nature in a joint way rather than protecting ourselves from it only, or protecting nature only from us. So I'll end here. I don't know the answer formally, I don't know the design, but I have a very good idea that the procedural techniques that were used to build the Highline are going to be the procedural techniques that are going to save my neighborhood. I think if we can use a very well-designed public piece of infrastructure and then design a building envelope to receive private investment as it comes in to reinforce the intent of that over time, that's how we'll be able to achieve our goals. So we'll see over the next year, the next couple years, but if these people are satisfied, so will I. And it's a question I've been thinking about a lot, and actually wrote a book about it that hopefully will be coming out in October. But the events are moving so fast that the questions keep changing. So if anyone wants to see urban design in action now, please come to New York, please look to our coastal neighborhoods, and you will see it unfolding in real time. Thank you very much.